Poštovani gledaoci, dobrodošli u još jedno izdanje emisije Granice Istoka. Ja sam Harun Karčić. Talas protesta u arapskom svijetu, poznat kao arapsko proljeće, počeo je krajem 2010. i početkom 2011. godine. Protestovalo se protiv autoritarnih režima i vojnih hunti koje su decenijama vladale u tim zemljama, ali i protiv inflacije i siromaštva. Reakcije na demonstracije bile su žestoke. Najupečatljiviji primjer je Sirija, gdje su snage Bašara el-Asada tenkovima i borbenim avionima ugušile proteste kako bi se on održao na vlasti. 10 godina kasnije analiziramo šta je ostalo od revolucionarnog zanosa. Razgovaramo zbog čega nije uspjelo arapsko proljeće, ko su kontrarevolucionarne snage i kakvu ulogu igraju danas Rusija i Kina. Prije razgovora sa našim gostima, pogledajmo osvrt jednog aktiviste i pripadnika organizacije Bijele kacige povodom 10. godišnjice ustanka protiv režima Bašara el-Asada.
Sirijci ovdje žive u veoma jadnim okolnostima. Neki od njih su u izbjegličkim kampovima godinama, u veoma neuvjetnim prostorijama. Mnogo je siromaštva, veoma je hladno, mnogo je zaraznih bolesti. Pojavio se i koronavirus, a česta su i bombardovanja. Zaista, Sirijci žive u najgorijim mogućim okolnostima. Stoga, 10 godina od izbijanja revolucije, Sirijci su napaćeni teškim uvjetima života i konstantnim bombardovanjem Asadovih i ruskih aviona, ali se i dalje nadaju da će se rat privesti kraju i da će moći živjeti normalno. Sirijci jednostavno žele živjeti kao i ostali ljudi u svijetu. Ja živim u Idlibu i mogu reći da su ljudi očajni za bilo kakvim rješenjem. Žele kraj rata. Oni nemaju više ništa izgubiti, jer su već izgubili sve. Domove, zemlju, očeve, žene, roditelje, djecu.
Detaljnije o 10. godišnjici arapskog proljeća razgovaramo sa Jomanom Qaddouri iz Atlantskog vijeća u Washingtonu. Jomana, hello and welcome to the Al Jazeera Balkans channel. Now, what started as a popular revolution in Syria metastasized into a civil, regional, and now perhaps sort of an international war with many different state and non-state actors. Is it possible at all to summarize how Syrians feel today? I mean, there are those Syrians who clearly want to keep the revolution alive. There are those who are still somewhat sympathizers of the Assad regime. And then there are those who are somehow disappointed that militants have hijacked their revolution.
Sure, and thank you for having me. Listen, of course, you're talking about tens of millions of Syrians. Before the conflict and the uprising, there were about as many Syrians inside of Syria as there were outside, which were about 20 million in each, both in the diaspora and then 20 million each within Syria. So it's impossible to capture all of the opinions of what Syrians believe and think today. But what is clear is that Syrians do not feel safe remaining in their country and going back to living under the security apparatus of the Assad regime, and are very frustrated with the lack of progress on the political front, the lack of any compromises on behalf of the Assad regime. And as I said, there are millions of Syrians. You can just look at the numbers to see the number of Syrians now in Europe, in America, in the region, all of whom are living in precarious situations and probably long to go back home, but don't return because it's simply not safe for them to do so. Now, Syrians within Syria obviously also have mixed feelings. I mean, many of them have remained because they look around and see the dire situation of Syrians, for example, in Lebanon, who have had their camps burned to the ground by different Lebanese actors, and don't wish to be displaced and become refugees in another country. And I think it is appropriate to say that 10 years later, many Syrians are asking themselves, why did we go out? What was the point of all of this, given the large amount of destruction? But I think the overwhelming sentiment is that Syrians think that they should deserve human rights like anyone else, and that even if they have not achieved those goals now or possibly in this generation, that maybe this might be laying down the groundwork for future generations.
Right, but in terms of destruction and human lives, how much did Assad's quote-unquote victory cost? And what kind of influence do you expect countries such as Russia, Iran, and even China to have in the future of Syria?
Listen, the World Bank, I think, has estimated the damage to be at about in excess of 400 billions of
Right.
billion dollars. It's a very huge amount, and I think it's going to. I think economists said it will take Syria 50 years to get back to just where it was at 2011 levels. So it's really a huge cost. That's not to mention the actual loss of human life. That the United Nations stopped counting at about 400,000 a few years
Right.
ago, but we know that the numbers have continued. We see the bombardment and the destruction every day. You have millions of children that are not only orphans and homeless, but they also have never stepped foot into a school, especially in Idlib. And in different refugee camps in the region, many children who have not had access to basic healthcare, let alone basic education. You have, approximately 200,000 that are still detained in Assad's prisons, tens of thousands of whom have vanished completely in those prisons. Presumably, it's presumed that they are dead. As we saw in Caesar photos that were recently, released and put on an exhibit throughout the world to show sort of the level of destruction within Assad's prisons. So the cost is very big. Now, will Russia and China and Iran step in? Listen, at this moment, there is a prohibition on companies that wish to do business in Syria via the Caesar Act that was passed in the United States. That went into effect in early 2020. I don't expect Chinese companies, therefore, to have the kind of economic involvement that many wished. Now, Russia and Iran have been footing, I think, the bill largely on behalf of the Assad regime. Both have invested billions. In Iran's case, I think tens of billions. And they are looking to right now not invest more in Syria, but rather get the international community to foot the bill via reconstruction. And they are also trying to really and primarily get a return on their investment that they have made over the last 10 years.
Now, what is interesting to note is that there's been an increasing amount of support among Western leftists for the Assad regime. Did they get hooked onto his us or the Islamic radicals narrative? And what is also interesting to note is that an increasing number of European far-right parties, including the AfD in Germany and Le Pen in France, are also voicing their support for Bashar al-Assad. How do you make sense of this left-wing, right-wing alliance of apologets towards the Assad regime?
Sure. Well, I mean, this is a phenomenon for those of us who've been following Syria that's been going on since the beginning. At the beginning of the Arab Spring, there was obviously overwhelming support for Egypt, for Yemen, for Bahrain, for Libya. And I think, the crux of this, especially, for example, if you compare the Egypt case to now, is that a lot of these leftists are instinctively anti-American. And so therefore, any leader that is pro-American or may have an alliance with the United States is problematic to them. And so they view, I think many of them have viewed the conflict in very black and white terms. So when it's come to Syria, Bashar al-Assad and his father, Hafiz al-Assad, who were historically known for their sort of anti-American stance and their cooperation with Iran, and sort of that resistance axis, they went back and started to make all of these excuses as to why we should support Bashar al-Assad, as to why he stands up against the West, why Russia's with him, and therefore, since Russia's with him and America's not with him, that therefore it must mean that he is the better guy in all of this. And it's really sad because it denies, first of all, the desires of the local population, which many of these leftists claim to be upholding. They claim that they are there, for the people of the region, and that they don't want to be run, by the West, ignoring completely the millions of Syrians who said, yes, we do want freedom. Yes, we do want liberty and our ability to speak our mind in our own country. And so instead of trying to understand the voices of the local population, they had a knee-jerk reaction against him. Now, like I said, the resistance axis in the region, primarily led by Iran and with its many different proxies throughout the region, is in close alliance with the Assad regime, and does a very good job, actually, of building on this propaganda of being an anti-Western alliance, and one that really fights for the people. And in reality, what we have seen is that resistance alliance has really assisted the Assad regime in the destruction of the country and in the destruction of the hopes and the dreams of the Syrian people.
Right. And finally, a number of Arab countries, including the United Arab Emirates and Bahrain, have recently opened their embassies and diplomatic missions in Damascus, and they began communicating with the Assad regime. Do you see other Arab countries following suit? And also, would you call this a win for the counter-revolutionary forces of the Middle East? The normalization of relations with Damascus?
Sure. I mean, listen, so far what we know is, that various Gulf countries have tried to, improve their relations with Assad over the past few years. This is not a new phenomenon that we're hearing about now. And we know that in each case that the United States was a big part of the reason why those countries backed off and did not pursue, full normalization of ties. Some of those Gulf countries already had embassies that never actually fully shut down in Syria, but operated at a very low pace, or removed their ambassadors, etc. But they continued to function at a very low level. And now I think there is a very real concern that these embassies are going to open full-blown relations, have ambassadors there, and try to rehabilitate what was lost in the past 10 years. Now, I think this is actually a losing battle for them. I think many of them try to do this, are trying to pursue this route in order to pursue sort of an anti-Iran or anti-Turkey strategy. I don't think that's going to go very far for them. Both Turkey and Iran have troops inside of Syria and do have very important interests of their own that they are willing to defend militarily. Whether or not those interests are necessarily coincide with the interests of the Syrian people is a very different issue, but each of those countries have their own interests that they're pursuing within the country. And frankly, I don't see any of the GCC countries willing to put any boots on the ground, and assisting or helping the Assad government by boosting it economically is not going to be enough. I think given all of the different interests at stake by the variety of different actors that currently are physically present inside of Syria. So I don't really see, normalization efforts going far or reaping the results that some of these countries hope to achieve. But further, and most importantly, I think it's going to take U.S. leadership to, I think, halt that kind of normalization. And so far, what we know from the Biden administration now is pursuing normalization with the Assad regime is not on the agenda.
Right. Jomana Qaddour, it's a pleasure speaking to you. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you for having me.
Od brzog kolapsa na izgled nedodirljivih režima do pojave militantnih grupa na Bliskom Istoku, arapsko proljeće ostavilo je neizbrisive tragove. Kako su reagovale susjedne monarhije, kako zapadne države, a kako Rusija i Kina, pojašnjavamo u nastavku. Idemo slikom do Washingtona gdje se nalazi John Hoffman, doktorand na Univerzitetu George Mason. John, hello and welcome to the Al Jazeera Balkans channel. Now, let me start by asking you, the 10th anniversary of the Syrian uprising was recently marked. There were such similar anniversaries in Tunisia, in Egypt, in Libya. The Middle East today is very much different from the pre-2011 Middle East. Who is in and who is out? I mean, which countries increased their presence in the region over the past decade?
Thank you for having me on, Haroon. You're absolutely correct. So the Middle East has been transformed dramatically since the advent of the Arab uprisings. In the 10 years since this wave of mass mobilization, the regional landscape has really come to be dominated by three competing regional camps. The first is what I call the counter-revolutionary bloc, and this is those countries that sought to quell the tide of mass mobilization and return to a pre-uprisings authoritarian status quo in the region, such as Saudi Arabia, the UAE, post-2013 Egypt, and Israel. The second bloc would be Qatar and Turkey, both of whom have sought greater independence in their foreign policies by supporting certain elements of the uprisings. And the third camp is constituted by Iran and its regional proxies and allies. However, it should be noted, these camps do not constitute formal alliances. There is both competition within these camps and cross-camp cooperation, so these aren't hard and fast alliances. Countries such as Egypt, pre-2013, Libya, Yemen, Bahrain, and Syria have really served as the battlegrounds for these competing camps, all of whom sought to, in one way or another, hijack, manipulate, or crush these popular uprisings for their own purposes. In addition to this, Russia and China have both significantly increased their presence in the region. Russia has, of course, intervened militarily in Syria. It operates mercenaries in Libya and Sudan, and has more generally increased its diplomatic, economic, and military relationships with a wide array of actors. Although China has not directly militarily intervened anywhere, its presence in the region has likewise increased dramatically. China is now the region's largest oil consumer, the largest trade partner, and the largest investor in the region. And this is all while the US has become less oil dependent on the region, and many are calling for a withdrawal from the region. So the strategic landscape has really shifted considerably.
You recently wrote that there has been a dramatic increase in direct outreach by Russia and China towards political Islam in the Middle East. Now, how do you make sense of that? And why would Moscow and Beijing be interested in political Islam in the Middle East?
Yeah, so typically most attention is given to the economic, diplomatic, and more security-related outreach of both Moscow and Beijing in the Middle East. But you're absolutely correct. Although their concerns regarding political Islam are not identical, both Moscow and Beijing have sought greater engagement with the Saudi, UAE, Egypt axis in order to hedge against perceived threats at home, as well as their respective regional interests in the Middle East. So domestically, both Russia and China are home to large Muslim populations who have historic linkages and interests in the Middle East. And many of these communities have been forcefully incorporated into these states by means of contested and challenged imperial expansion. For Russia, the greatest concern regarding its domestic Muslim population has been to prevent state and non-state actors from supporting Muslim opposition against the Kremlin, particularly in Chechnya, but also other autonomous republics. Following the collapse of the Soviet Union, Russia fought two wars against Chechnyan separatists and often argued that these forces were aided by actors in the Middle East. If you fast forward to the 2011 Arab uprisings, these concerns have remained constant. Russia still fears the eruption of unrest among its Muslim communities, whether it be popular mass movements or more extremist actors. And they fear the external support being provided by these domestic oppositionists. Moscow, of course, became especially concerned following the collapse of several states in the region, particularly Syria, where over 4,000 Russian citizens and 5,000 citizens from other post-Soviet states estimated to have traveled to Syria, the majority of them fighting with groups such as ISIS or Al-Qaeda. For China, the greatest concerns they have are primarily centered around their Uyghur community in the Xinjiang province in the west. Xinjiang serves as China's gateway to the west, to greater Eurasia, and hosts 15% of China's proven oil reserves and 22% of its gas reserves. China views its Muslim minority as a serious security threat and has sought to, quote, sinicize Islam and establish a monopoly on religious discourse and activity through the Chinese Islamic Association. However, in these efforts, they have detained over 1 million Muslims and are holding them in internment camps where they face torture, are faced to renounce Islam and pledge loyalty to the Communist Party, and are often executed for their non-compliance. Moreover, in these camps, they have adopted very draconian measures to slash birth rates among its domestic Muslim population via forced IUDs, forced abortions, and forced sterilizations. They claim that they're carrying out these actions under fighting terrorism and that these individuals are, quote, infected by an ideological illness. But really what it is an attempt to eradicate the Muslim community in China. In regards to the Middle Eastern context specifically, as Russia and China's interests in the Middle East continue to grow, so too does their stake in the prevailing status quo. Islamist actors, whether they be mainstream or radical, who seek to upend the political order in the Middle East are viewed as anathema to the expanding regional interests of Moscow and Beijing.
That was exactly my next question. I mean, is the ultimate objective of both Moscow and Beijing to bring religious activity and Islamic discourse under the control of the state, just like it is done in Saudi Arabia, in the Emirates, and in Egypt?
Yes, I would say so. So for Russia, given its more personalistic authoritarian system, this would mean using individuals with close personal connections to Putin in order to advance this agenda. For China, given its more institutional, party-based authoritarian system, this means using institutions connected to the state to preach loyalty to the Chinese Communist Party, primarily the Chinese Islamic Association. Moscow and Beijing both fear the exportation of political Islamism, whether it be mainstream or radical, from the Middle East and the challenges such ideologies can present to their own authority. Both Vladimir Putin and Xi Jinping view the Muslim communities within their countries as a national security threat that needs to be contained. And they share the mutual objectives with the Saudi, UAE, Egypt axis to construct such a state-controlled Islamic discourse favorable to their regimes, which typically renounces all forms of Islamism outside of the control of the state as, quote, terrorism, and the promotion of what they call moderate Islam. But again, this moderate Islam is really just state-controlled Islam and a depoliticized Islam.
Poštovani gledalci, bio je to John Hoffman, istraživač na Univerzitetu George Mason u Washingtonu. 10 godina je prošlo od prvih protesta na Bliskom Istoku. Libija, Jemen i Sirija su danas teritorijalno, plemenski, ideološki i politički veoma podijeljene zemlje sa pokidanim društvenim tkivom. Pojavili su se novi regionalni, ali i svjetski akteri, a svaki od njih pokušava steći što veći geopolitički utjecaj u toj regiji. Poštovani gledalci, bilo je to sve u ovom izdanju emisije Granice Istoka. Ako ste propustili bilo koji dio, emisiju možete pregledati na našoj web stranici balkans.aljazeera.net. Hvala na pažnji.